webinar. This is Tom Reynolds. I'm the Vice President of Export Solutions. And we have a lot of people that are still joining, but we want to make sure that we respect everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. Depending on questions, we may be done sooner than that. But I'd just like to welcome everybody. I hope everyone's having a good day. And today we're going to talk about license exemptions and exceptions. I would say that this is often an overlooked area of compliance when we're talking with a lot of people and clients who understand the need for a license, but sometimes they never stop to consider whether an exemption or an exception applies. So we're going to take a deep dive into some of those and hopefully help you out with understanding those things. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. I just want to say that the disclaimer that we have here basically just says that we are experts on ITAR and EAR regulations. However, if at any point something that we say or present here conflicts with what is in the regulations, obviously the regulations themselves are the controlling document and the authority on these rules. Just a few housekeeping items. Hopefully you can all hear me and you can see the slides that are being presented right now. There's two ways that you can join the audio connection. One is through the internet using VoIP, or you can dial in using this phone number and access code. Right now everyone is muted, and we will, for clarity's sake and ease of use, we're just going to keep everyone muted on the call throughout. However, we would like to talk with you and have dialogue. So the way that we can do that, if you have questions or want to ask something, please use the chat or the Q&A box that's on your GoToWebinar toolbar, and that way we will be pausing for questions at various points throughout the session, and we can I will jump back in and ask the questions, and we can have dialogue with you that way. It's just easier. We've tried before where we unmute people, and it just doesn't work as well as this. I will say that one of the questions we get often and regularly is, what about the slides and the slide presentation? So I will answer that question right now. Usually within a week, if you go to our website, which is exportsolutionsinc.com, within 1 week of today's session, we will have a copy of the slide presentation available for you to download there, as well as a recording of this session that you can view. And it's a pop-up box that will allow you to view the recording with the slides. So if you missed this session, or you want to come back and revisit it at some other time, or you want to have another colleague within your company, you can certainly come back within a week and view it. And the slides are available to you for free. We just ask that you not sell or transfer them or use them outside of your organization. We do have a series of free webinars that we offer throughout the year, and the next one that we're going to be doing is in May. It's going to be talking about best practices for Schedule B and HTS classification. So at any point you can go to our website, register for that session, and all of our webinars are free. So right now I'd like to introduce Marcy Gentry. She's going to be leading us through today's topic, and she is our senior consultant for trade compliance. Marcy lives in Dallas. She has over 17 years of experience working with ITAR and EAR regulations for a variety of companies. And she was also sorry, folks, I'm getting over a cold and still losing my voice in and out here. So, but anyways, Marcy was also an adjunct professor at the University of Austin, teaching import-export compliance for a while. So, Marcy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Tom. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So we'll go into the agenda as far as what we'll be covering today. What the main things we'll be looking at are what a license exception and exception are. When we talk about exceptions and exemptions, when we look at license exceptions, those really apply to the EAR. So everything that would be exported out under the EAR that once would require a license from an X in the box, and I'll explain that in a minute, then you can use a license exception from the EAR. Exemptions apply really to those items that fall under the ITAR. So we'll really talk about the exemptions. We could probably have a whole seminar just on license exemptions. Today we'll really focus on the EAR license exceptions and the different types that you can use, and then we'll just go into some common ITAR exemptions. We won't go into a lot of detail just because of the time frame that we have, but we will talk about both. So when we talk about the license exceptions under the EAR, you really have to take a look at the country groups. The way that the EAR is set up, one of the key things you need to look at is these different charts that they have within the Export Administration regulations. And they divide these countries into different country groups. There's country group A, B, D, and E. And you really need to understand what those country groups are and where to find them, because dependent upon what license exception that you're going to use, it may depend on the type of country or which country group that it falls into. So one of the things I wanted to show you is what the country groups look like. Let me just go back here real quick. So in the regulations, the supplemental 1 to part 740 of the EAR, there's also the country chart, so I don't want to confuse the two, but the country groups you'll take a look at when you're reading the license exceptions within the EAR. It may refer to country group A1, and so you would look at country group A and then take a look at the columns in here. So country group A1 would be all the countries that have an X in the box under A1. Country group B is a little bit easier to deal with. It's all these countries that are listed. If the country's on here, then it's country group B. Now what you'll see is that there are some countries that are in both country group A and country group B. So just because they are in both country groups, it doesn't mean that you can't use the license exceptions because the items or the countries listed in one or in both. You really have to read each license exception requirement in the EAR. The next thing is to go over the country chart. So when you are looking at your ECCNs, you're looking at the ECCN and seeing what the controls are. You use that country chart to determine if there's a license. So I won't spend a lot of time as to whether or not you've determined that a license is required, but the point that I want to show you here is that when you're looking at the country chart and you see what the different controls are, the chemical biological weapons chart, the nuclear proliferations chart, where there's an X in the box, some of the license exceptions we'll talk about is the ECCN controlled for national security requirements only, or is it controlled for other concerns? What you need to look at is the ECCN itself to determine what are the controls, and I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. But one of the things you need to take a look at is when you're using license exceptions, there's an overall rule that for most of the license exceptions that exist, if the item's controlled for missile tech, so going back to this chart for the missile tech, then you can't use the license exception. In addition, there's a lot of controls for things that may be controlled for crime control reasons. There are some exceptions to that rule, but for the majority of the license exceptions that are in the EAR, crime-controlled items cannot use a license exception. Of course, anytime you're sending something to an embargoed destination, a license exception is not valid, and that's generally for the 5 countries that we talk about in country group E1, which is Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. In some cases, you can still send to Sudan and Syria for things like EAR 99, but for the most part, those 5 countries don't qualify for license exceptions. License exceptions can't be used on QSR 11. That's a sensor that's in the navigation category 7 of the Commerce Control List, and the QSR 11 cannot be used, or you cannot use a license exception when sending out that type of a sensor. Anytime the items for specially designed implements of torture, anytime that there's a prohibited end use. So when we talk about prohibited end uses, those are the items that would be used to make weapons of mass destruction. So anytime the items may be going for development of long-range missiles, nuclear or biological chemical weapons. At that point in time, you can't use a license exception for that type of an end use. So repetitious listening devices, you cannot use a license exception for. In particular, that's the ENC license exception. And any time the transaction is part of a voluntary disclosure. So that really also goes with the requirements where you know that a violation has occurred, you've submitted a voluntary disclosure, you have to wait for that voluntary disclosure to be completed before you can use those license exceptions. And in some cases, even before you can get a new license if there is a license required. In addition to that, you need to look at, there are certain exceptions for the 600 series. And when I talk about 600 series, that's the new ECCNs that were implemented under the export control reform. Only certain types of license exceptions can be used for that 600 series, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. So you worked your way through, you know what the classification of your part is, you know that the item is controlled for certain reasons. You go to look at the country chart and you've determined that there's an X in the box and it says that there's a license that's required. Your next step would be is to go take a look to see if there's a license exception available. There's two ways, two different types of license exceptions that you can look for. One is the list-based license exception. Those are the license exceptions that are just for the ECCN. So each ECCN will list out what license exceptions are available. The other type of license exception that you may be eligible for is a transaction-based license exception. These types of exceptions are not listed under the ECCN. You actually have to go back to the regulations under Section 740 and read the paragraphs under that license exception to see if you qualify. Don't worry, this may all sound like French to you here, but this we'll go through this in more detail of what are the list-based license exceptions, how do you find them, and then what are transaction-based license exceptions, and how do you go look to see if your shipment qualifies for those. This chart just shows you the different license exceptions that are available to you. We won't go through each one of these today. That could be a 3-hour seminar or webinar if we go through that. But we will go through the ones that are most common. We will go through the list-based exceptions, all except for the APP under 740.7 of the EAR. The computer license exception, APP, really is just based for computers. But the LVS, the GBS, the CIV, and the TCR, those license exceptions are used on multiple ECCNs throughout the EAR. So we'll talk about those. Those are some of the most common list-based exceptions that are used out there. And then we'll go into some of the transaction-based exceptions. And once again, here we won't go through all of these. We'll just go through some of the common ones like the temporary import, export and re-exports, or TMP, RPL. We won't go into a lot of detail with ENC because once again you could have a whole webinar on ENC on the encryption stuff, which really just applies to encryption. And then there's some other few things in here like BAG as well as AVS and STA. We'll talk a little bit about STA, which is also part of the export control reform under the 6 Series 100s ECCNs. So what is a list-based exception? So here's an example that came right out of the Commerce Control List. We have an ECCN of 3A002. When you look at that ECCN, you will see underneath the ECCN the reasons for controls. When I showed you that country chart, you looked at what are the reasons for control for these items. So the first one is national security. What you would do is you look at that country chart that I showed you earlier in column 2 of the national security, and you would see if there's an X in the box, the country that you're shipping to, a license would be required. If a license is required, then you can come down to this section of the ECCN to see if there's a list-based license exception. And in this case, you have 3 different choices that you can use. You have LVS, which is low value shipment. We'll talk about that one here in detail. You have GBS, which is country group B, that's available to you. And then you have CIV. But the key here too is that you want to make sure that you look at your subparagraph. So when you're classifying your items, this is one of the reasons why we tell folks that you really want to make sure that when you're assigning an ECCN to your product that you're including the subparagraph, because it will make a difference as to what license exceptions that are available to you. So if you see under here, under LVS, LVS, the value of $3,000, but it's only good for the ECCNs with the subparagraphs. So if you've decided that your product qualifies or has assigned an ECCN of 3A002.A, it qualifies for LVS. If your product is 3A002.A.2, it still qualifies for LVS, but it does not qualify for GBS. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the subparagraphs for your products to make sure that you understand what you can and cannot use as far as list-based license exceptions. And as you look down here under CIV, which is civilian end use, which is another license exception, it provides some more details of what you can use CIV. So you can use CIV for 3A002.A1, and then you have to meet all of the conditions that are listed here. So once again, just don't assume that because you're 3A002 and you see LVS, GBS, and CIV here, that you can use those license exceptions for your particular ECCN. You have to go further with your classification and make sure that it's listed in this section. You will also see that STA is available, license exception STA. Now, STA is kind of one of those unique license exceptions. It's not really a list-based, but it kind of is, it kind of isn't. But you really have to look at the section in the regulations under STA to make sure that you can use that. We'll talk about STA here in a little bit more detail. So some of the most common list-based exceptions, GBS. GBS is used quite frequently for a lot of the products. GBS is for country group B countries. So I showed you that country chart as that supplemental one to the regulations there that talks about what country groups they're in. So if your country's listed in country group B, then you can use GBS. GBS is only good for commodities. You can't use it for technology. So if you're trying to send information or technical data regarding the production, the use, the development of the items, you cannot use GBS. Now when you start looking at things like user manuals and that type of thing, you have to go back and ask yourself the question as to whether or not your user manual, is it publicly available, do you publish it? And so you may have a different classification for the manual for that particular product. But when you start talking about technical data, you cannot use GBS. In addition to that, you can use GBS when in the ECCN it says yes, like I just showed you, and that it's for national security reasons only. And so when you go back and take a look at this particular part, the national security reasons only would be is when you're looking at the country chart, and the country chart only has an X in the box for national security reasons, then you can use license exception GBS. If it has an X in the box for national security reasons and AT reasons, then you cannot use GBS. The next one is TSR, which is technology and software restricted. Now TSR is used quite a bit to allow the technology transfers of products that are controlled. So if you have an item where you can use GBS, generally you can also use TSR, but under the ECCN and the technology section, it will tell you whether or not you can use TSR, so I have GBS here. But if it's TSR, yes, then you can use TSR. It's good for technology and software only, so if you have software that's related to the product or technology that's related to the product, then the TSR is good. And once again, it can only be used for country group B countries. In addition to that, you have to get a letter of assurance. There is information within 740 of the EAR where the TSR license exception exists. It provides the language that needs to be put into that letter of assurance. The letter of assurance needs to go to the end user. They would sign that letter of assurance and provide it back to you. You should not send or transfer any technical data or software to the end user or the foreign entity until you have that letter of assurance on file. The next exception that we're talking about today is CIV. CIV is for civilian end users. Once again, in the ECCN, because it's a list-based, it has to say under the ECCN, CIV yes. CIV is really used for like the country group D ones. These are the more unfriendly countries to the U.S. government, like China, and a few other of the communist countries or old COCOM countries are listed in D1. Now, under CIV, that would mean that the end use is going to be for civilian use. So you're maybe sending it to a civilian end user in that country, but you also have to make sure that it's going to be used for civilian end uses. So for example, if you're sending it to a procurement company in China, you have to make sure that that Chinese procurement company isn't going to forward it over to a military entity. So in cases like this, we would always suggest that you would get some type of end-use certification from the customer, not necessarily the BIS 711 form, but some type of written assurance from that customer of who the end use is and who the end user is going to be. You can also use CIV for technical discussions that for some products that are controlled under the export regulations, and that's generally for deemed export transfers. So those who are not familiar with the deemed exports are the transfer of technical data to foreign persons while they're here in the U.S. And under that, before you can use CIV, you actually have to go through a foreign national review. And the issue with the foreign national review is that it may just take as long as a license. But the key here is that when you submit a license, it's on a project-by-project basis. When you're doing CIV for a deemed export review, then it can apply to lots of different technologies that would qualify for CIV. Hey, Tom, I hear a lot of feedback.
Sorry, I'm not hearing any. I'll check and make sure people are muted. Hang on.
Okay. Okay. The next license exception is LVS. This is another good exception that you can use for your products. If LVS is marked yes underneath the ECCN, you can use LVS. Now, the issue with LVS is you really have to keep track of the shipments that are going out. Under LVS, you can ship to country group B. In addition to that, there is a value that's stated, and you can only ship out the value in one particular shipment that's listed in there. You cannot go over the value that's listed, and I'll show you that in just a minute. You can't split up shipments so that you can keep the value of the shipment below what the threshold is. If you have an order and you're shipping everything out the same day, you can't just split the shipment and say, okay, we'll ship the other one out tomorrow so that we can use LVS and avoid getting a license. Eventually you'll get caught doing that. You can go up to 12 times the value that's listed under that ECCN, so you can ship out as many times as you want per year as long as you don't go over 12 times the value that's listed in there. So here's an LVS example. The ECCN that I have here is 3B002. You can see under here that it qualifies for LVS for $500. So what that means is you can do any number of shipments that you want. Each individual shipment cannot be over $500, but you can ship up to a total of $6,000 per year. So 12 times the value of 500. So 12 times 500 is 6,000 in one calendar year. So you want to make sure that you are reviewing those. You have to keep track of the shipments, and that's the one thing about LVS is that you want to make sure that you're always looking at and keeping track of all those different shipments that you're doing on that. In addition, you can only go to the country group B countries. And so, Tom, I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. Also, folks, if you are still hearing audio issues or whatever, please talk with me through the chat bar or the Q&A bar. We'll try to resolve that for you. So the first question is, what is the best practice for claiming exemptions in a large company? Do you only have the compliance group approve exemptions? Do you let employees claim them on their own? How do you document them?
So that's a good question. It kind of depends. In a lot of large companies, they have automated systems that will automatically look for license exceptions, and then the person that's reviewing it would choose what license exception is available. Most larger companies would have an export compliance division, office, or department, and in that case it should be back to the export compliance department to make those decisions. I wouldn't have the salespeople or the shipping folks make that decision unless they're well versed in the export regulations, because as you can see, you have to go back to the regulations and you have to look at all of the different requirements and make sure you meet those requirements. When you're looking at a system that makes a decision as to what license exceptions are available, so when I say that, there's systems like SAP GTS or the Oracle GTM tool, you can program those systems to make an assessment as to what license exceptions are available or which ones you use. I've also seen some companies that prefer not to use certain license exceptions, for example, LVS, because there's the burden of doing this reporting requirement and tracking shipments that go out under LVS. They choose not to do it because they can have a violation if they're not tracking it properly, especially if there's a large number of shipments. But if you're a medium to small company and you don't have a lot of exports to the same customer, you certainly should take advantage of LVS or any of the other license exceptions. In addition to that, you also want to make sure that you have record keeping. So if you have any of these license exceptions, especially for technology, what I find that a lot of companies fail to do is to record any exports against license exceptions when it's technology transfers. And under the export regulations, the record keeping requirements are that you have to keep records on all export transactions. So when you have those discussions of technical data and you use a license exception, you want to make sure that you're recording those license exceptions somewhere. So, you know, people start to have a heart attack when they say, hey, every time I pick up the phone and talk to my engineer that's overseas, that means I need to record it. Well, yeah, actually it does, because you have had an export. You've exported technical data with that telephone conversation or even an email, so somewhere it needs to be recorded, or you need to be able to have a way of figuring out how to record that information if it's going out under a license exception. Any other questions, Tom?
Great. Yeah, there's one that's just related to what you were just saying, which is, and maybe restating what you just said, but how do we claim TSR if we don't physically export our software? It's exported via the internet, no physical shipments. So
that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've worked for a number of companies that do software downloads, and one of the things that you want to make sure that you do, or what you can do, is you can post your software out on the letter of assurance, the TSR letter of assurance is what most people call it, with that language, and you can have an I accept button on the letter of assurance. So that's the first thing. So before you transfer any technical data or software under TSR electronically, someone needs to sign or accept the letter of assurance, and then you need to keep a record of that. So someone would have to log it, or the system would log it, that the I accept button was hit, and who did accept it. So generally you would have some type of PIN and password or some type of information as to the login to get the download of that software. The next piece of it is that you would want that system to log the download. So if it's publicly available information, then you're probably not even under TSR anyway, because it's publicly available software. If it's not publicly available software, I would assume that your company is keeping track of who's purchasing the software, downloading the software, so they would have a record of that download. So as long as you have a mechanism to log who's downloading it, when they're downloading it, and that they've accepted the TSR letter of assurance online, that would be your record that the item was exported under that TSR. Any other questions, Tom?
Yeah, one more question. We have an approved ITAR license, but I think now an exemption will apply. Can I use it, or do I have to use the license now?
Be very, very careful with the ECR reform. If you have a license for an item that's under the ITAR, the first thing you have to do with export control reform is to look at your classification. So if your classification of your part is now moved over to a 600 series part number or to another ECCN within the commerce list, and I'd be very careful of how that classification is, then you need to go back to that ECCN and look for the license exceptions that are available for it. If it becomes a 600 series part, generally they have the STA license exceptions available, But when we get to the STA, you will see that there are some requirements for certain 600 series parts. So for example, if you are exporting aircraft parts, your aircraft part was under 8AH, which is the parts and components for aircraft. Now it's moved over to the 9A610 or the 9A616, I believe is it, or 19. Those two 600 series parts under the Commerce Control List. If you go back and read STA, there has to have been a previous export license. So if you have a license for that part in the past under the ITAR, your parts now qualifies for the 9A610, then yes, you can use STA as long as you can meet all the requirements under STA, and there's a lot of requirements there. It has to go to certain countries, it has to be end use by certain countries, you have to do notification, so you want to just make sure that you meet all those requirements for STA. So yes, you can certainly use a license exception now. It just depends on the classification, so you're going to have to start all over with the process and look at the classification and then go into that ECCN, look for the list-based exceptions. Some of these transaction-based exceptions that we'll go into will exempt the 600 series parts from being to qualify for those license exceptions. In other words, you can't use some of these transaction-based exceptions for 600 series. So one of the key things here when we talk about license exceptions is that you always have to go back to the regulations and make sure you meet all the requirements under there. Some of these exceptions, I'm going to show you here, Part 740, it has paragraphs and paragraphs, and the only way you can determine whether or not you meet that exception requirement is to read through them and check it off. In some cases, I know some clients and exporters will have a checklist if they want to use, let's say, license exception STA, they will go through and say, do we meet this requirement, do we meet this requirement, do we meet this requirement, kind of have a checklist. And so that may be a good way of a record to make sure that you qualify for those license exceptions each time. Same thing with LVS. You know, as my product going to country group B country, is it this value? So you just really have to take a look and see what works best for your company, especially if there's multiple people that are making the determination. It may be a way to make sure that everybody's making the right choices, is to have kind of a checklist. Anything else, Tom, at this point?
We have more questions, but let's continue with the presentation. We'll stop again.
Okay. So the next band of license exceptions under the EAR are transaction-based. And so when we talk about transaction-based, they're not going to be listed under the ECCN, but they usually qualify for multiple ECCNs. So once again, you really need to take a look at Part 740 of the EAR. And let me just bring that 740 up. I know I have it. Maybe I do. There we are. So under 740, this is the license exception section. So if you look at 740, it's going to list all the different ECCNs. Some of the list-based exceptions, one is TMP. A lot of people use TMP. TMP is temporary imports, exports, and re-exports. And when you look at the section that has the license exceptions, you want to read through each paragraph. For example, this LVS, it has the scope of what you can use. Then it'll talk about the definitions. So when it talks about an order, so you got to make sure that when you have an order, what does it mean when you have the order, and not just shipments. Same thing with net value. So you want to make sure you read each one of these sections. Don't just shortcut it and think, oh, LVS is there, I'm going to go ahead and use it. Make sure you go back to 740 and read all of the requirements to make sure that you can meet every single one of those requirements. The GBS is probably the easiest here to read. It's going to country group B, and where it has GBS yes on the CCL. When you do other things, you really want to make sure that you're looking at for these transactional based, is that you're looking at all those specific requirements. Let's see if I can find one here. TMP. So under TMP, there's these different paragraphs, and so you want to make sure that you start with the paragraph that you're looking at. So you have temporary exports, re-exports, and in-country transfers. So you got to take a look here. There are some exceptions for things like 600 series items to destinations in country group D. So once again, you want to make sure that you look at the 600 series, look where you're going to, look at the country group in D5 to make sure that you're not using TMP for any products that may be going to country group D5. So yes, you can use some license exceptions for those items that have moved over, once again, to the USML, but you want to make sure that you can qualify for that, looking at where you're shipping items to. In addition, for things like TMP, there are specific country requirements. So depending on where the person may be traveling, like with a laptop, you can use TMP. So a lot of people use when they're doing things like trade shows and they're bringing products with them, or engineers that may be bringing some tools, or salespeople are traveling with their computers. A lot of people will use TMP, which is temporary export, but you want to make sure that you're meeting all those requirements within the section of the EAR. Oops, how we got back there. So TMP, really a lot of times what you'll use TMP is for repairs abroad. If you have an item, you're sending it overseas to be repaired and it's coming back, you can use TMP. The key with TMP is that the item has to come back within a year. And once again, a lot of people use TMP for things like tools of trade and things for like calibration and testing. It will be for, like I said, the computers that may be going over, engineers that may take their tools and then they're going to come back. The key with all of this is that if you're using TMP for tools of trade, those items that are being exported out need to stay in the possession of the person that's taking them. So does that mean they need to go to dinner with their laptop in their hand? No, but they do need to make sure that it's secured and that it's not open and it's not turned on so that the cleaning crew can come in and see it. In reality, it should be turned off, so there should be PIN and password protected to open it up. And in a lot of cases, we tell folks, if you have a safe, you want to put your computer in the safe or the tools in a safe. But it really shouldn't be left at, let's say, your customer site or your foreign subsidiary site overnight and out of sight of the person that's hand carrying those items under tools of trade. The other thing is that that TMP can be used, once again, for inspection, calibration, testing, or repair. That doesn't mean they can enhance the item, but in other words, if you have approval for that item, you're sending it overseas to the manufacturer so it can be repaired, then you want to be able to bring it back, as long as it's the same item that's coming back and that it's the same person that you originally got the items from. You can also do returns of unwanted shipments under TMP. The one thing here is that 5E002, which is technology, and really any technology, is not available under TMP because you can't temporarily export technical data. Once you export technical data or provide technical data to someone, it stays in their head. You can't remove it. So TMP cannot be used for that. The other thing you can use TMP for is beta testing software. There's a whole section in regards to beta testing software. Generally, it's around the encryption regulations. So you really want to take a look at that, read what it says. There's some forms that need to be signed, and some reports that need to be ran. So take a look to see if you really want to use that license exception TMP for beta software. The next common one is RPL Servicing and Replacement. So transaction-based, this is kind of the opposite of TMP. If someone may be shipping something into you and to be repaired and then it needs to go back out, you can use RPL. Items imported from country group D1 except China. The RPL can be used. So China is not available for RPL, so you want to make sure that you're taking a look at where you're shipping your products to. Don't just assume that you can use RPL under the country group D, or under RPL for country group D1. And the other issue is that when you're exporting the products out to the end user to repair the items in the U.S. and you send it back out, it has to be to the same person that sent it to you. And the reason for that is they're going to assume that you've already exported that product in the first place under a license or under another license exception, but under some type of approval. So you want to make sure that it's coming back to the same person that sent it to you. The other thing is that really you're just repairing it or you're replacing it as a one-for-one for the same type of product. There should not be any enhancements to the item. The only enhancement, so to speak, is that you've repaired the item and now it works. But you can't give it a better functionality than what it had before. The next transaction-based exemption is APR Additional Permissive Re-Exports. This is for commodities only and re-exports only. So this is when you're going to re-export hardware. A lot of times you can re-export those items under APR. And a lot of times this comes in place if you have a subsidiary overseas or if your customer, your foreign customer has subsidiaries in other countries that they need to re-export the goods to, then you would, this is one of those exceptions that you can utilize. A lot of people forget about this exception and get licenses when they don't really need to. So keep in mind that you have this APR license exception that can be used for re-exports that may allow you to transfer items without having to get a re-export license. Just keep in mind there's a whole bunch of requirements here, so that's one of the reasons why people don't want to use with license exceptions, just to make sure that they're not quite sure if they qualify or not. But just keep reading it, kind of do a checklist as you go through it to say yes, 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 or no, 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 that you qualify for each one of these things as you read through the EAR for these transactions. The next one here is STA. So STA came before the export control reform went into effect in on October 15th. So STA you could use for lots of ECCNs that were out there, but was really created to kind of help with the export control reform for those items that were moving over from the commerce or from the U.S. munitions list to the commerce control list. And so under STA, or the Strategic Trade Authorization, and Tom, I hear somebody again, so I don't know if someone's unmuted or not. It's really for those countries where the U.S. has a lot of agreements with, and so a lot of the European Union countries, Japan, UK, Australia, those types of countries where we have a lot of agreements with as far as military agreements, you're allowed to send some of these items out. But once again, you want to make sure that you are looking at all of the requirements, okay, for those particular products. Most of the time, it can only be used for those items that have NS controls only. And if you look at a lot of those items that go over to the 600 series, they may be controlled for lots of different items, so you under lots of different controls. So you want to make sure that you look at your ECCN, look at the controls, and go back and look at STA. One of the things under STA, especially for the new 600 series numbers, is that you have to notify the person that's receiving the goods what the classification is and what the requirements are for re-exports. So in other words, they can't re-export it. When you use STA, the end user is the end user. They are not allowed to re-export it without an authorization from the U.S. government. So whether that be a re-export license or some other type of exemption or exception that's out there, then you can't re-export under STA. The other thing you want to keep in mind, as I talked about it earlier, is that like if you're dealing with the aircraft parts, and there are some other ones too, that you want to make sure that you've had a license previously before you can use STA. So I will tell you, I have a client, they have a part that used to be under 8A, or 8H, was parts and components of military aircraft. Under the export control reform, it has now moved over to a 9A610X. Under that 9A610X, STA qualifies. But when you go back and read STA, it says they must have had a license from either the Commerce Department or the State Department before you can utilize STA. So they never had a license before, so now they have to go get a license before they can utilize STA. So you really got to read the fine print when you're looking at license exception STA. Just don't automatically assume that you can use it because it's under there as the list base. Okay. And so I'm going to ask if there's any questions on that.
Yeah, Marcy, a couple of questions. Just a clarifying one here. Is STA only for 600 series ECNs or other ECCNs allowed?
No, there are other ECCNs other than the 600 series that STA does qualify for. They did have STA out there for different ECCNs before the 600 series was published, but it was originally developed for these items that would be used for export control from, but it can be utilized for others, but it is a list-based. So you have to look at the ECCN, and under the ECCN in the regulations, let's go back and take a look. It has to be listed at this part, I think. Let's see. There's the other example that I showed in here. Oops. Sorry. Don't want to make you guys dizzy. If you look down here, the STA is list-based. It has to be underneath the ECCN and says that it qualifies. So this is an example. The 38002 is not a 600 series part, but STA does. You can use STA, but you have to make sure that you read the entire requirements under here. Under STA, so it can only may not be used to ship any item under 3802.G.1 to any of the destinations listed in country group A6. Okay, so you have to make sure that your product's not classified in this particular case under 38001 or 38002.G.1, and that that the destination is in A6. So that's an additional requirement as to what's in the paragraphs under 740 for the STA license exception. I know that sounds really crazy.
Okay. Another question on STA. Can you confirm that it cannot be used for re-exports? My understanding was if the re-export transaction is eligible for re-export under STA, then you can use it same as with any other exception.
No, you cannot. If you look at the documents and the requirements on the documentation in STA, STA cannot be reused for re-exports, is my understanding. But you know what? I'll have to verify that. But I'm pretty sure that when you're sending that submission to your customer with the requirements of the ECCN, that it states that it cannot be re-exported under STA. But I'll have to verify that too. But I'm 99.9% sure that you cannot be used for re-exports. But I'll verify it.
Okay. Thanks. This next question is about TMP. It's kind of a long question, so we might need some more info from you, but we have engineers using equipment overseas under TMP. What is the window for return to the United States? Can they come back to the United States for a few days within a year, then return to foreign customer a few days later and still use TMP? How long must they stay in the United States before returning?
Certainly. So that has to come back within the year under TMP. Once they come back in, they can export it the next day under TMP again, as long as they're not staying out of the country for more than a year under TMP.
Okay. Let's continue then. And folks, if you have any other questions, just go ahead and submit them via the chat box. Thank you.
And Tom, I'm actually, okay, nope, sorry, I lied. Where was I at? Okay. So that kind of brings us to the ITAR. So once again, the exceptions are for the EAR, the exemptions are for the ITAR. I will tell you, when you look at ITAR exemptions, be very, very careful. There are only a few exemptions that are out there that don't require a prior approval. And what I mean by a prior approval, that do not require a license or an agreement that was previously approved. There are a few ITAR exemptions out there, like the Canadian exemption, which we'll talk about, that you can utilize, but there's a lot of requirements around that. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the first place. One of the key things, if you use an ITAR exemption, in order to use an ITAR exemption, you have to be registered with the State Department. So under the ITAR, you can't utilize exemptions, you can't submit licenses, you shouldn't be manufacturing anything unless you're registered with the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Only upon registration are you allowed to utilize the exemptions or submit licenses under the ITAR. So that's the key thing that you want to make sure that you do before you try to utilize an ITAR exemption. Make sure, just like when you're dealing with license exceptions, that you're reading all of the conditions under the exemptions. The ITAR sometimes is a little bit more straightforward than it is under the commerce regulations. The commerce regulations, the exceptions may send you all over the place. Under the ITAR, they're generally in the same section, but they're not, or the same area that the exemption is written. However, they're not in the same place in the ITAR. You will find things like technical data in one part of the ITAR. You'll find exceptions to sending defense articles or hardware in another section. So you may have to search around to find the right exception out there. What I will tell you is that the SIA, the Society of International Affairs, does publish a book that talks about exemptions and the requirements, and that's a good book to purchase if you plan on utilizing a lot of license exemptions under the ITAR. It's a good tool to use. In addition to that, there are some tools that are out on the government website that can help you with some of the exemptions that are out there as well. And also, what I didn't mention too before is that the EAR BIS has some tools for STA to see if you can qualify for STA or whether or not STA can be used. So there are some tools that the government's coming up with so that you can utilize these things. One of the things too that's different between the ITAR and the EAR is that every time you use an ITAR exemption, you are required to submit an AES record. When you're dealing with exceptions under the EAR, you're not required to do an AES record unless you hit the value threshold. So there are a couple of differences there. But just think about it this way. Every time you have an ITAR shipment, whether you use a license or an agreement number or an exemption, you do have to do an AES record regardless of value. Some of the common ITAR exemptions that are out there are 123.4, temporary import and export. Those are some of the key ones. 123.9, the NATO, Australia, Japan. The basic operations and maintenance under here, 125.4 is a big one, and 124.3 is another big one. What I will tell you, under 123.4, and the other ones would be like 124.3, 125.4, those types of exemptions are you can utilize after you've had a previous approval. So under the temporary import export, this is something that will cover repairs of items. So kind of like we were using for TMP or RPL under the EAR, 123.4 does the same thing. But what it states in 123.4 is that there had to be an approval to export the product in the first place. So you want to make sure that you've got the proper approvals in place before you can utilize 123.4. In addition to that, there are some items that you cannot use 123.4, some SME items that are not eligible to use that 123, SME being significant military equipment. So once again, you want to make sure you go back and read 123.4 to make sure that your item qualifies for that repair exemption. One of the other things that you need to be aware of too when you're using these exemptions, you do need to note on your documentation, especially with 123.4, that you're utilizing the temporary import and temporary export. Especially on the temporary import, on your 7501 forms, your customs entry documents, you need to note that you're using 123.4, because when you get ready to export those items out under 123.4, so they come in, you're getting them repaired, and then they're exporting back out, then on the export documentation and in AES, it's going to ask you for your entry number, and you need to be able to show to customs that it was imported properly under that exemption, and then it's going back up. So you have to have this type of reporting mechanism or tracking log to show what the import came in as and when it went back out on. So there's this little game that you need to play to make sure you're keeping track of your imports and your exports. So kind of going back into this, when you're using the temporary import exemption, you can bring the items in or you can bring them out for 4 years. So if you import the item in to the U.S. to be repaired, it has to be exported within the 4 years. If you're exporting the items out of the U.S. to be repaired by a manufacturer overseas, it has to come back into the U.S. within those 4 years. If you don't, it ends up being a violation on the regulations. The key thing here is that the item is really only being serviced or repaired. It's not being enhanced. So whether it's the import or the export side of it, you want to make sure that the item is not going to enhance the functionality of it. It's just repairing it, or you're just inspecting it, or you're just testing it, or calibrating the item. Once again, the entities that are part of the transaction, so either the exporter or the importer, they have to be the same. So if the item's coming into the U.S. and going back out, it has to go back to the same location and the same end user. It can't go from one location, from your customer's location to you, and then you send it to a subsidiary of theirs in a different country. It has to go right back to where it came from. So those are the key things there. A lot of times you can use the ITAR temporary import exemption for things like trade shows. When you do that, you want to make sure that, once again, when it's imported in, you're noting on there on the 7501 form, or if it's being hand carried in, that's going through customs, and someone is making sure that customs knows that it's coming in under those ITAR exemptions. And Tom, I'm going to stop there, see if there's any questions on that repair exemption under the ITAR.
We don't have one on the repair exemption, but there is one on the exemption for tech data. So
okay.
It says for ITAR exemptions for tech data, is an AES always required?
Now, so when we talk about AES, it depends on tech data. So you got to look at the census regulations when you talk about AES records. If you're sending the technical data via electronic, so it's you're having phone conversations, or you're emailing it, or someone's downloading it, no, you do not need to do an AES record. But you need to record it, right? In other words, you need to log it, saying that this tech data went out under this exemption on this date, and this is what it is, and this is where it went to. But an AES record is not required. If you're to take the technical data and it's going out on a hard drive, and it's going to your shipping department, and you're shipping out the hard drive, or the manual, or it's a hard copy of the print or the spec, then yes, you would have to do an AES record because it's a tangible export. So you only need to do the AES record when it is a tangible shipment.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions for now.
Okay. The next license exemption is 123.9 retransfers to NATO, Japan, and Australia. So this one also assumes that when you first exported the items out that you had a license or an agreement, or it was previously approved under another exemption. But you can use 123.9 for retransfers to NATO, Japan, and Australia. So you want to make sure you look at this. This is really if it's going to one of those government or agencies, or it's going well, let me start back. It's not going to one of their prime contractors. It's going directly to one of those government agencies. So this is a lot of times where a lot of people can't utilize 123.9 because you're usually dealing with a prime contractor of one of these agencies. So there may be ways to get around things to utilize one of these exemptions if you can get the items to ship directly to the government agency and then they hand it over. I mean, there's some ways of getting around it, but you also want to make sure that you're meeting those requirements under 123.9. The products do have to be U.S. origin. It can't be SME equipment, and it cannot be major defense equipment. And there's definitions within the ITAR as to what these are. So if you're familiar with the ITAR, if you look at the USML category, and there's an asterisk next to the category in the subparagraph, it's an SME item. And then there's certain major defense equipment that's listed in the ITAR. Then those are going to be things like the military aircraft, like an F-35, or some naval ships and things like that that are pretty expensive, and they're considered major defense equipment. You cannot utilize the 123.9. Okay. Under 123.9, you must provide written notification to DDTC no later than 30 days from the re-export. So you still have to notify DDTC. You can't just go ahead and do the transfer. You still have to give them notification in writing. And it's just a simple letter that you would write to DDTC explaining what the product is, where it's going, and who it's being transferred to, and the location. So it's really just for their information so that they can track some of these items that are being re-exported under this license exemption. If you're going to use this exemption, and you're originally exporting it from the U.S., it's going to go to one place, and then you know it's going to be re-exported, so it's going temporarily to one location and then be re-exported. You would note that on your AES record and your commercial invoice. 123.16, which is exemptions of general applicability. These exemptions are used for things like trade shows, mock-ups, spare parts, so a lot of customer demonstrations and things of that nature. You really have to take a look at what the requirements are under this as to what really qualifies under this license exception, or exemption, excuse me. There's a definition of the types of things that you can utilize for this on the mock-ups and spare parts. And you want to make sure that your part really qualifies as a mock-up or a spare part under this. You can't ship it to prescribed destinations just like you would with any other ITAR item. You can't go to this 126.1 countries like China and Venezuela, just to name a few. It can't require congressional notification, so there's other things like the major defense equipment over the $100 million congressional notification requirements. It can't be listed on the missile technology control regime. It can't be an SMI, and obviously it can't go to a restricted party or a debarred party on one of the lists. Under spare parts, exports of components or spare parts and the value is less than US $500. So the key here too is that you had to have had a license to export the product itself. So if you want to export spare parts, let's say they got the product and there's a specially designed belt for this part and that belt wears out. You want to be able to send them spare parts so that they can change out that belt every time it runs out. As long as the value is less than $500, you can go ahead and use this exemption as long as you've had a license to export the overall product in the first place to the same end user. And once again, it has to go directly to the entity that's listed on the license that you've had before. And it can't be enhanced, it can't be a new one. You cannot make shipments. You cannot make greater than 24 shipments per year. So you can do up to 24 shipments of no more than $500 per year for spare parts. You also have to make sure that you put the exemption in the AES record under this exemption number. Packaging, and a lot of times when you're dealing with ITAR items, especially some of these advanced high-tech parts, they create special packaging for these parts. And so I worked for an aircraft manufacturer, and they had special Pelican cases that were designed for parts for these aircraft. Ship the items out into the Pelican cases, and then they would come back empty. And because those cases are form-fitted just for that ITAR part, then that kind of is an accessory. It's defined as an accessory under the regulations. So you can use 123.16b3 to get the items back or to import those items back in that special packaging. In some cases, you may be exporting to your customer under those Pelican cases or special crating, and you want to get that packaging back so that you can utilize it for the next shipment to another customer or to that same customer. So this is a way of you getting your packaging back from that customer, or sending the customer's pack or your supplier's packaging back. The next exemption here, 123.16b4 for the models or mock-ups under 123.16. This permits the export of unclassified models or mock-ups of defense articles. So a lot of times people will take the models or mock-ups to these trade shows. The issue with the models or mock-ups is to make sure that they're not operable, so it's really just a dummy picture or figurine of the model or the mock-up, and they can't reveal technical data, and sometimes that's kind of hard to do. But really you're trying to make sure that when you have these models or mock-ups that it doesn't give away certain types of technology so that somebody can recreate it. So sometimes it can be smaller on these models or mock-ups, or larger than what the original thing is, but there may be other things, like if you're providing a model of a circuit board, that may give away information as to where how the circuit board is set up. So you probably will not qualify under this, but you really have to take a look at it, do an assessment on your model or mock-up to determine whether or not it's giving away any technical data. And it can't contain any components that are controlled under the ITAR. So if you have this model or mock-up and then you have the specialized chip on it just to show, and the chip's controlled under the ITAR, you want to make sure that you remove the chip, otherwise it doesn't qualify for this exemption. So really, when you're doing models and mock-ups, you got to take a look at it, and sometimes it defeats the purpose of having a model or mock-up because you want to show some of the technology that you have. 123.16b5, public exhibition, trade shows, air show, or similar event. The issue here is that you can utilize this, but once again, this is one of those exemptions where you have to have had approval if you're providing this technical data and it's not publicly available or in the public domain. You had to have a license to provide the information to the people that you're going to demonstrate to. The same company that I worked for before that made aircraft, and they would take those aircraft over to the various air shows over in France and other locations, or even to air shows in the U.S. where foreign governments would be there in attendance. They wanted to be able to show the aircraft off and that type of thing. The issue is that there were a lot of systems on the plane, and there was even things on the outside of the plane that could give technical data away. So they would go ahead and get a license rather than use this exemption because it would provide a lot of information on there. So you got to be kind of careful when you're utilizing this exemption. You got to go back to looking at, is there some technical data that could be revealed if you're showing a specific product at these trade shows. And Tom, I'll stop real quick there and see if there's any questions.
No questions so far.
Okay. This next one is a license exemption that you will utilize quite frequently, especially if you have TAAs, technical assistance agreements, or manufacturing license agreements under the ITAR. In addition, sometimes people get DSP-5s for a one-time transfer of technical data. So things like build to print. If you're just sending a print to a manufacturer to build, and you're not providing this defense service around it, you can utilize this exemption after you've got the license. I have to make sure I say that. What happens when you have a TAA or an MLA, so the Technical Assistance Agreement, or an manufacturing license agreement, or a DSP-5 permanent export license for technical data. The first time you transfer the technical data out, you would utilize whatever the agreement number is, the TAA number, the MLA number, or the DSP-5. If you re-export those goods, I shouldn't say re-export, but you export the goods or the technical data again, so let's say it is a print that you've been authorized to export under a DSP or under a TAA, and now you need to change it because the label was in the wrong spot on the drawing and you just have to change the label to a different location. You're re-exporting that, or you're exporting again that same drawing, just a little bit of changes, but not modifying the capabilities of the product with that drawing. Then you would export it under this exemption. So the first time you export the technical data under the TAA or the MLA, you'd use this 124.3 technical data and furtherance of an agreement. Subsequent exports would be under this exemption. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's just the way that the ITAR is written. So what does that mean? One of the key things when you're using these exemptions under the ITAR is that you got to log it. And so a lot of the big defense contractors out there will have their employees complete logs, whether they're on Excel spreadsheets or they have some database. But every time you export technical data out under a TAA or an MLA or under this exemption, which is technical data in furtherance of this agreement, then you have to log it. It's an export, so you have to have records on it. So there's certain ways that you can do that, and each company is different. And yes, that means the phone calls, the meetings that people attend. As long as there's technical data that's going out under that agreement or in furtherance of that agreement, then you have to log those exports. 125.4b5, basic operations and maintenance. This is another one where you have to have a license approved before. If you have a license that allows you to export a product or a defense article out under the ITAR under a DSP-5, then you have to, sometimes you send a user's manual or a maintenance manual, as long as it's this basic operation and maintenance, how to utilize the product. It can't go to a higher level where you would repair an item or fix an item. Those are a little bit higher level and don't qualify under this 125.4 depot level operation and maintenance. And it's kind of a military term, but you've got to take a look at it because there are some definitions within the regulations as to what is basic operation and maintenance. But under this exemption, you're allowed to send that technical data that allows for basic operation and maintenance, so like the user's manual or operations manual, as long as you have a license to export the product, the piece of hardware, to that same end user. Okay. And 125.4b7, return of technical data. So this authorizes technical data, including classified information, being returned to the original source of import. So some examples in this particular case would be your foreign customer has sent you a drawing for you to utilize when you're manufacturing something. You can send that drawing back to them under 125.4b7 under this ITAR exemption. However, you still want to make sure you have a license for the hardware. It doesn't allow the export of the hardware. Let's say if you're manufacturing, this only allows the return of the technical data that was sent to you in the first place. It has to be in its original format. You can't have enhanced it or modified it. 126.18, dual third country national employees. This allows for foreign licensees to screen employees for security clearance under the export regulations. So it amends some of the requirements when you're getting a TAA and MLA. You really need to take a look at this section. This doesn't mean you can't get a license or you don't have to get a license. You really want to make sure that you take a look at what you're doing and when the requirements are. So these are some things that are under the TAAs and MLAs that allow you to send technical data to some third country nationals once you have the agreement in place. The Canadian exemption is one I think is probably underutilized, but it's also one of those things that is used a lot of times and doesn't and some of the transactions don't qualify. Under the Canadian exemption, under 126.5, you're allowed to export certain ITAR items, generally is anything that's not under the MTR or classified to the Missile Technology Control Regime or something that has like a security clearance, a secret or top secret item under the Canadian exemption. The issue with the Canadian exemption is that the end user has to be for a U.S. government entity or a Canadian government entity. The entity that you're shipping it to in Canada has to be registered with the Canadian registered person or the Canadian Control Directorate. And it's kind of similar to what the DDTC registration is here in the U.S. They have to register with the Canadian government to show that they manufacture or export military items. You can look online from the Canadian government. You can put in the person that you're shipping the items to see if they are registered. So there's an online tool, unlike the U.S. where you can't figure out if someone's registered or not. The Canadian government does have a search engine that you can take a look at to see if the company is registered. Then you have to make sure that the items are going to be used for the Canadian government or the U.S. government. If they're not, you can't utilize the Canadian exemption. So those are the main things that you need to do when you're dealing with the Canadian exemption. And so, Tom, I'll stop there and see if there's any questions on these exemptions.
No questions.
Okay. So some of the case studies that we have, aerospace companies that manufacture of a CF-43, a commercial gas turbine engine. While used in several regional jet models, this engine has yet to undergo civil aircraft certification. So under this case study, aircraft company receives an order from the distributor in the Czech Republic for the 10 C-43 aircraft. The distributor's sales territory covers Eastern Europe, selling 90% of its inventory into the Russian government. What license exception, if any, authorizes this transaction? So under this, the distributor sold 3 of the engines to the Russian government for the integration into their VIP transport aircraft and 2 to the Russian airframer. And I'm sorry, what license is available for these transactions? And you know what? I'm going through these and I don't see that we have the answers on here. What I will do is we'll send out these case studies with the answers to those case studies to give you an idea as to what the answers are to those. So Tom, that kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions that are out there, I'll be happy to answer those now.
Yeah, we'll just give folks a few minutes here to type any other further questions that they have into the dialogue box. Thanks for the presentation, Marcy, and sorry for that oversight there, folks, on the answers, but like Marcy said, we'll get those included in the slides so that as you go through those case studies, when you download the slides from our website, you'll be able to see the answers to the questions, and that should help you get, at least give some illustrations on the way that the exceptions and exemptions will work. Okay, so here's a few questions coming in. Let's see, if an individual is Canadian goods registered, could this be used as an exemption for ITAR license required commodities?
You can utilize the Canadian exemption as long as you meet the other requirements. So if they are registered with the Canadian government and you're shipping items to them, let's say it's a Canadian prime contractor for the Canadian government, then yes, you can utilize the Canadian exemption as long as the items that you're exporting don't fall under the missile technology control regime, and as long as they're not classified, and as long as the end user is going to be the Canadian government or the U.S. government.
Okay. Here's a question. I have a question relating to technical data and foreign nationals. I was asked recently to review our company's monthly report and provide feedback as to whether or not it contains technical data. If no technical data is found, the monthly report is emailed to the chairman of the company, who is a foreign national. The report usually shows financials, but I noticed this report has updates from production and quality regarding a few parts that I know are ITAR controlled. Would those updates be considered technical data? They include information about whether or not planning was approved and what revisions, and if they're having issues with the supplier or outside processing.
So the answer to that is it depends. So from the information that was provided in the question, if there is no technical data, so once again you have to assess whether or not what's being provided to them is technical data. Generally when you're looking at cost of a part number, where an item is being manufactured isn't technical data. When it starts talking about things like bills of material, that could be considered technical data. But if you've done an assessment that there's not technical data, then there's no transfer of technical data, so it's not an export of the technical data. Certainly there's export of proprietary data, but the proprietary data is not always technical data. So it sounds like that there's really not an issue as long as you've done the assessment that it's not technical data. Manufacturing location isn't. I mean, sometimes manufacturing locations or ship-to locations when you're dealing with defense items can be classified as secret, but at that point in time you would know if it is classified as secret, and it shouldn't be put into a report that's going on all over the place. So that would be my only concern, is if maybe a ship-to location or factory location or something like that was classified as security clearance level. But other than that, if it's just a manufacturing location, no, it's not technical data.
Great. Thank you. Next question. What is a forward role of insurance shippers are using proper exceptions, exemptions?
Can you repeat that? It kind of cut out a little bit, Tom.
Sorry. The question is, what is a freight forwarder's role in ensuring that the shippers are using the proper exceptions and exemptions?
Well, the exporter's not the USPPI as defined in the EAR, and they are not the exporters defined in the ITAR. Your freight forwarder, if you've got a good one and they see that you're doing something wrong, they'll come back and tell you, but are they going to be held accountable? No. Unless it's a blatant export going to, let's say, an embargoed country or an arms embargoed country, and they know that the item's an ITAR one. The government can come back and hold them accountable, but for the most part, it's your responsibility as the USPPI or the exporter to make sure that you're utilizing your exceptions and exemptions properly.
Great. All right, at this point, I don't see any other questions coming through. Folks, I just want to say thank you, and thank you to Marcy for going through this information and going into a lot of detail on this and hopefully answering a lot of your questions. Just a reminder as well that we will have this recording available for you to view on our website, typically within 1 week of the event, so check back about this time next week. And also there will be a copy of slides that you can download from our website for free. Appreciate everyone joining today, and hope this was a good session for you. And please check out our future lineup of free webinars on our website as well. Thanks, everyone.